We took part today in the launch of the most recent publication of the World Bank. In your opinion, how important is this document?
We think it's very important as a signal of the great importance of education and what we can do to realize its promise. This is the latest World Development Report, the World Development Report 2018. That's the flagship publication of the World Bank each year. We've had those publications now for 40 years on different topics, and this is the first one devoted entirely to the topic of education. And so we're very excited. We think this sends an important signal. What it's saying, because this was the first report announced after the agreement on the Sustainable Development Goals, this is sending a powerful signal that the foundation for achieving all the development goals in all the area is really education. That education contributes to reaching health goals, political cohesion goals, jobs, all of those goals. Really, a good, strong education is a foundation for that. And so in this report, we delve into the promise of education, what's going wrong with that promise, and what we can do to realize it.
The World Bank report has the following title, Learning to Realize Education's Promise. Could you please explain the symbolistic of the title?
Sure. By education's promise, we're referring to the fact that education is a foundation for achieving so much else. For individuals, a good education leads to better employment possibilities. It leads to higher earnings. It's the most certain way out of poverty in a sustainable way for individuals and households. For societies, it promotes productivity growth. It promotes employment broadly. It promotes poverty reduction at a national scale. And it also has a lot of non-economic benefits. For families, it makes them healthier. Educated families are healthier. Their children are better educated. They are more likely to be resilient when there are shocks, economic shocks, financial shocks, environmental shocks. Those who can respond the best have the most education. And it also makes countries, it gives them better institutions. It allows for more trust, more social cohesion when populations are more educated. All this is the promise of education. The title is Learning to Realize the Promise of Education, or Learning to Realize Education's Promise. And the reason for that is, although education promises a great deal, we aren't fulfilling that promise because there's a learning crisis around the world. Too often, schooling is not leading to learning. And so the report tackles that problem. It describes it, talks about where it's coming from, and then how we can tackle it, how we can make sure to realize education's promise.
The report presented today in Romania explores 4 major themes. Could you tell us what are these themes?
Sure. The first theme is, as I said, it's about the promise of education, as I've just described, but also how we're falling short. So that first theme looks at how the promise is falling short because of the learning crisis. And what we mean by learning crisis is that looking around the world, we see in many countries very low levels of learning. So you have, for example, children finishing primary school without basic literacy or numeracy around the world. You have very slow progress. In a country like Brazil that's making progress, it's going to take, at the current rate of progress, 75 years to reach the rich country averages in math scores, 260 years in reading. So very slow progress, even in the countries that are making progress. And then we see high levels of inequality. So in many cases, there's very low learning among the poorest and most disadvantaged communities. And that really hurts the children from those communities. So this is the learning crisis that we need to tackle. We get into what's driving it, what are the causes of that, which we can describe later. But so that's the first topic is the promise of education, how it's being undermined. But then the next 3 topics are about how we can realize education's promise. And there's really a 3-part strategy. First is assess learning. So make this the hidden exclusion of low learning, that's what we call it, because when children are out of school, we can see that. When they're in school and not learning, we often don't see that if children aren't tested, if we don't see how little they're learning. So that's the first thing. Assess learning to make it a serious goal so we can all agree on tackling the learning crisis. Secondly, at the level of the school and the community and the individual student, act on evidence to make the schools work for learning. What that means is really use everything we've learned about helping to prepare students, for example, through early childhood development, through nutrition and stimulation and preschool, helping teachers become more effective and making sure they're in the classroom, that they're well trained using proven techniques for in-service training, and that they're supported. Making sure that materials and technology are used in a way that supports the teaching and learning process, because otherwise it's not going to have an effect. And then making sure that school management, that you have strong, well-prepared principals who can bring all this together. So that's the second set of actions. And then third, align actors to make schools work, to make the whole system work for learning. And what that means is making sure that all of us, so not just educators, but all of us have responsibility for learning for all students. And that means politicians, bureaucrats, it means NGOs, it means parents, it means the business community. All of us need to be aligning our efforts to support learning and inclusive learning for all students, and sending a strong signal to schools that that is what we care about.
The report is a global assessment of education. Can you briefly describe the education situation in Europe, in the United States, in Africa, Asia, China, and Japan?
Sure. I mean, all of those countries and regions have their own challenges at different levels. In some countries, for example, in much of sub-Saharan Africa, you have some very basic problems. For example, we show that 20% of teachers are not in school on any given day across 10 African countries when they should be teaching. And another 20% are in school, but not in the classrooms teaching. So what that means is you're losing 40% of teaching time. So sometimes we're dealing with very fundamental problems like that. In other countries, the problem is perhaps teachers are in the classroom, but they aren't well trained on how to manage a class. They aren't well trained on the best pedagogical techniques for reaching children. They aren't given the support they need to make sure that the most poorly prepared students are able to learn. So that's a different type of problem. In other countries, for example, in East Asia, which is doing very well on some of these measured cognitive skills, the learning, the math. Some countries like Korea are seeking ways to try to build up the socio-emotional skills of students.
Let's see a little bit in the future. Technology is changing the world, and it is changing jobs. How can we be better prepared for tomorrow's world?
That's really a crucial question. So the future of work, the future of life. How do we prepare today's students for what's going to be in their global environment in 20 or 30 or 40 years? Part of the answer is we don't know exactly. We can't say exactly what jobs are going to be here in 30 years. And so it's very difficult to try to give them job-specific skills that will work for them for their whole life. What we can do, though, and what we know, is that foundational learning is going to be essential for them. What that means is making sure that all students have really strong functional literacy, functional numeracy, their ability to reason, ability to discern what is good evidence, what is bad evidence, what are good ways of learning. Really, all of these are foundational to learning how to learn. And that's a skill our students all need to come out of school with, is learning how to learn, because everything is going to keep changing. So they're going to have to be able to keep reskilling themselves, re-equipping themselves with the skills that are necessary for these increasingly demanding jobs. So these jobs that, as we heard in the session today, it's really cognitive, non-routine skills that they need. So the kinds of things that allow you to adapt to a situation and to reason quickly, figure out a situation, figure out where to get the resources you need, and then deploy them. That's what our students need. And they need that both as workers, but also as citizens. They have to be able to analyze information, understand political promises, understand how to act on them, what sense to make on them. So really the same types of skills that make them good workers will make them better citizens and better family members and better members of the community.
The report also presents less known and debate issues, namely the crisis of education. How does this education crisis manifest itself? How can it be identified and measured?
So I've already described some of the key features of the crisis, which are these low levels of learning, the slow progress in improving learning, and the high inequalities that separate the rich and advantaged students and their learning from those of the poor and disadvantaged students. So we can measure those by making sure we have good learning assessments, that we're testing samples of students so that we understand what's going on in the system, so that we can really shine a light on these hidden exclusions. But that's just one element of the crisis, those poor outcomes. We also need to understand what's driving it. And what we see is a first set of drivers, a first set of causes at the level of the school or the individual student. And that's things like poverty and malnutrition that leaves some students less ready to learn. That's things like lack of availability of preschool for poor students. So again, they arrive at school not ready to learn. It's things like teachers, as I mentioned, not in the classroom even when they should be, or teachers who are not prepared, who haven't been given adequate training to deal with very challenging situations. Things like technology, investments in computers that don't reach the classroom. That's another manifestation of the crisis. Or principals, managers who aren't able to manage a school because they've been selected just on the basis of seniority, perhaps, and not on the basis of ability or inclination to manage, right? So that's another element of the crisis at the school level. And then we have a crisis also at the level of the system, and that's the third big factor. And that's driven by the technical complexity. It's really hard to get an education system all working together and aligned toward learning, but also political factors. We aren't, in many systems, we don't have all the actors, as I mentioned, so employers, parents, politicians, bureaucrats, all sending the signal to the educators that what they should care about is learning for all students, rather than other objectives like getting politicians reelected or keeping taxes low. We really need to focus attention on what the goal of education should be, and that's learning for all students.
In Romania, there is a concept of functional illiteracy. Is this a facet of the crisis in education?
Absolutely. I mean, there are different levels of problems with literacy. In some countries, it's at the level where students can't even recognize letters or read words, even after having been in school for several years. In Romania, that's not the issue, but the issue is functional illiteracy. On the OECD PISA assessment, it shows that 40% of Romanian 15-year-olds are essentially have not really achieved functional literacy or functional numeracy. So they're at the very basic level of learning or lower. And that's driven in part by very low levels of learning among the most disadvantaged students. So I said 40% for Romanian students on average. It's 62% for the poorest students. And that, as you mentioned, is really a fundamental problem, because these 40% or 62% of the poor students, they're just not equipped to deal with today's labor market, let alone tomorrow's labor market. They don't have the cognitive skills. They haven't learned how to learn, and they're not going to be able to adapt as technology changes, as economies change, as new opportunities open up.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.